The land had been barren for months. No rain, no crops, just endless dust swirling in the wind. But this one farmer, with nothing but dirt under his nails and a stubborn streak, found a way to make his crops grow through the storms. When everyone else had given up, he discovered a secret that would change everything. Before we dig into this remarkable story, share where you're watching from, and if tales of survival and ingenuity move you, hit subscribe because tomorrow's story could outlast even the storms. The soil was cracked, dry, and almost as dead as the hopes of the settlers who once came to these plains with dreams of endless bounty. For years, the winds had torn at the land, pushing the dry earth into clouds of choking dust that blotted out the sun. With every storm, the sky darkened further, and with each passing day, the farmers watched their hopes crumble just like the soil beneath their feet. The Great Depression had already taken everything: money, crops, stability. The Dust Bowl seemed like the final blow, and many believed it was the end. But for Thomas Green, it wasn't the end. It wasn't even the beginning of the end. It was simply another challenge to face head-on. Like the rough winters back in Iowa. Like the long, quiet summers spent farming the hard soil. People around him packed their things, abandoned their farms, and fled to towns that still had a semblance of life. But not Thomas. He had a farm to tend, a family to feed, and a stubborn pride that kept him rooted to the very soil that was tearing his life apart. With every storm, the dust piled higher, covering the crops that had once thrived in this fertile land. Each gust of wind took with it a little more of his sanity, a little more of his hope. But something kept Thomas out there, the idea that there must be a way to grow through the dust, to make life emerge from this wasteland. It was in these moments, with the sun blocked out by the dust and the earth itself screaming for mercy, that he started to think of a solution. He watched the storms as they came: the wind, the sand, the relentless power of nature. Thomas wasn't just observing the destruction, he was studying it. What made the dust storms so powerful? How did the earth around him change when the storms raged? And then, through a combination of desperation and an old farmer's wisdom, it hit him a simple thought, one that could turn everything around. Water, he whispered to himself, like it was a secret he had known all along. But the water couldn't just come from anywhere. It had to be protected. It had to be kept safe from the dust. And so, Thomas began experimenting simple tricks at first, small changes to the way he had been farming for years. There was no blueprint for this, no guide. He had to make it work or lose everything. Thomas worked tirelessly, experimenting with different techniques he remembered from his father's farm and from the old journals he had inherited from other farmers who had long since given up. One thing was certain: his crops wouldn't survive the same way they had before. But how could he change things without starting over? The answer wasn't in grand gestures or new machinery, it was in the soil itself. It started with the trenches. Thomas dug deep, carving narrow channels in the earth that cut across his rows of crops. These trenches weren't just for water, they were his defense against the dust. The wind, which had carried the deadly dust across the plains, could no longer just sweep across his land without resistance. His trenches, formed carefully along the slopes of his land, acted as barriers, catching the dust and redirecting it before it could reach the precious crops. At first, it seemed like a futile effort. The dust continued to build up, covering everything in its path. The trench idea didn't seem to stop the dust storms, but it slowed them down. And slowing them down was a start. The next step was water, the one thing that had always been scarce. The one thing that could bring life to the thirsty earth. But how could he water his crops when the drought continued and the storms never stopped? Thomas's answer came with a more drastic measure: mulching. While it was common to use mulch for gardens in more temperate climates, here on the plains it was unheard of. He began laying down layers of dried grass and leaves over the rows of crops, building a blanket over the soil to lock in moisture. The mulch didn't just protect the plants, it acted like a barrier, cushioning them from the full force of the dust that rained down with each passing storm. It wasn't perfect, and the dust still came in waves, but slowly, the crops began to show signs of life. The green shoots that had been buried under a sea of dirt poked through, their fragile leaves reaching toward the sun. Thomas could hardly believe it, but there they were, plants that had survived the worst dust, storms, and drought in decades. Other farmers, seeing his success, came to watch. They asked him what he was doing, How he had made it work when everything else had failed. And for the first time in years, Thomas felt like he had something to teach. He told them about the trenches, the mulch, and the careful watering he had done to protect the earth beneath his feet. Soon, word spread. The secret trick that Thomas Green had discovered began to take hold. His crops didn't just survive, they began to thrive. The dust storms still raged, but the people who had stayed behind now had hope. The earth could be tamed, if not entirely conquered. And with every passing storm, the memory of a life lost in the dust began to fade, replaced with the quiet understanding that survival, even in the worst conditions, was still possible. Word of Thomas Green's secret trick spread quickly across the plains, reaching those who had abandoned their farms long ago. Some of them couldn't bring themselves to believe that a solution could exist amidst the unrelenting dust and despair. But for those who were left, for the ones who hadn't given up, Thomas's methods were a beacon of hope. He had done something no one else had been able to do: make the land yield again in the midst of desolation. But as the first green shoots of life began to push their way through the soil, the next wave of storms came crashing in with brutal force. The wind howled like a beast unleashed, the dust rising in an endless cloud that blotted out the sun. Thomas had never seen a storm this fierce. The last storm had taken most of the crops of his neighbors, and now it was his turn. The relentless winds howled like a banshee, sweeping across the land with such power that even his carefully protected rows of crops trembled in fear. He watched from the window of his small cabin, helpless, as the dust storm raged. He had worked so hard, the trenches, the mulch, the watering. It all seemed for nothing in the face of this furious storm. The dust filled the air like a suffocating cloud, thick enough to make the world disappear. It wasn't just dust on the crops now. It was dust in his lungs, dust in his eyes, dust in every crack of his home. For a moment, Thomas sat down, staring at the storm outside. Was it even worth it? What did survival mean when the land itself seemed intent on swallowing everything in its path? His body ached with exhaustion, his hands raw from labor, his mind clouded with the uncertainty of what was next. The storm was unyielding, as though the earth itself was trying to force him off. It was then that the quiet thought returned, the same thought that had pushed him to work through the long, dark nights when others had long since given up. There was no turning back. For better or worse, the land was his, and he would fight for it until the very last. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. The storm raged for hours, and the wind, which had been his adversary since the beginning, seemed like it might finally break him. But when it passed, when the sky cleared just enough to let the sun filter through, Thomas made his way back outside. He stood at the edge of his farm and looked out at the horizon. The trenches, now filled with dust, still held their ground. The mulch he had laid was almost buried. But his crops, still fragile, still small, had not been completely wiped away. They had stood their ground, just as he had. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. His crops had made it through the worst storm he had ever seen, and if they could survive this, they could survive anything. The dust storms continued, but with each one, the land grew more resilient. Word of Thomas's success spread, and soon more farmers came to him for help. Some were hopeful, eager to try his methods. Others, broken by the years of hardship, were reluctant to believe that such a simple trick could be enough. Still, they came. And one by one, Thomas showed them the way: the trenches, the mulch, the careful watering that protected the earth from the storms. As the weeks turned into months, the fields began to take on a new character. The crops, which had once been smothered by dust, now rose above the earth with renewed strength. Green stalks swayed gently in the wind, their roots firmly anchored in the rich, protected soil beneath. The land was beginning to heal, and so were the people. They had not only learned how to grow again, but how to endure together. Thomas spent his days working side by side with the others. The new settlers, the ones who had stayed, shared their knowledge and their hard-won experiences. It wasn't just about farming anymore. It was about community. The harsh winds and unyielding storms were always a threat, but now there was a sense of unity that had been missing before. Together, they had found a way to survive. But even as hope began to return, Thomas knew the worst wasn't behind them. The drought still lingered, and the dust, though less fierce now, never truly stopped. Yet, for the first time in years, the farmers had learned how to fight back, not with anger, not with defiance, but with careful, deliberate action. They had learned to respect the land, to understand it, to work with it. For Thomas, this was more than just about crops. It was about legacy. The soil beneath his feet, the same soil that had once seemed so hostile, was now a symbol of everything he had fought for. His efforts, his experiments, his secret trick, it was all part of something larger than him now. It was part of a future for his children, for his neighbors, and for anyone who was willing to put in the work to endure. As the years passed, the winds grew quieter, the dust storms less frequent, and the land once again began to prosper. Thomas's farm thrived. It wasn't just the crops that grew, it was the community around him. The people who had once left the plains, the ones who had abandoned their land in despair, began to return. They returned not because the storms had stopped, but because they had seen that survival was possible, even in the hardest of times. Thomas Green's secret trick had made his crops grow. But more than that, it had made hope grow in the hearts of all who witnessed it. And as the plains slowly recovered, so did the people growing, learning, and enduring through it all. The dust storms never fully ceased. Even in the years that followed, the winds would still whip across the plains, stirring the soil into swirling clouds of grit and sand. But something had changed, something deep in the land, in the people, and in Thomas himself. Where once the dust seemed an insurmountable force, now it was just another part of the struggle. No longer a beast to be feared, but a challenge to be met. Thomas had grown older, his hair streaked with silver and his hands weathered from years of labor. His once small farm had grown into a thriving homestead, a testament to his ingenuity and his unyielding determination. But more than that, it had become a place of hope, a beacon for the other farmers who had stayed and fought through the storms. By now, the techniques he had pioneered had spread throughout the region. Farmers came from miles away, asking Thomas for advice on how to build trenches, how to mulch, how to conserve water. What had started as a desperate attempt to save his crops had blossomed into a movement of survival. But Thomas never considered himself a teacher or a savior. He was simply a man who had learned to live with the land, not against it. One afternoon as he worked in the field, his son Jacob came up to him, a smile on his young face. Jacob was no longer the child who had watched his father toil in the dust. He had grown strong, his body lean from years of working the land. He had seen the land change. From the barren wasteland it had been to the fertile ground it had become. Jacob had never known the plains without the dust, without the storms, but he also never knew a time when they couldn't fight back. "Pa," Jacob said, looking out across the farm, "this place, it's different now. It's not the same as it was before." Thomas looked up from his work and squinted into the sun. The land stretched out before them, rows of crops, rows of life. The earth that had once been so unforgiving now seemed like an old friend, one that had fought alongside him, one that had endured as much as he had. The wind still blew, but it didn't carry the same weight of destruction. It was no longer the sound of nature's fury. Now, it was just wind, the same as it had always been, only now it could be lived with. "I reckon you're right, son," Thomas said, wiping the sweat from his brow. "It's not the same, and that's a good thing." Jacob nodded, his expression serious. "Do you think the storms will ever stop?" Thomas looked out at the Rodi Biaus horizon, the land rolling away into the distance. There was something beautiful about the way the earth lay under the sky, the way the land seemed to breathe, despite the hardships it had endured. "No, son," Thomas said slowly. "I don't think the storms will ever stop. But we've learned to live through them. We've learned how to make the land work with us, not against us. And that, my boy, is how we survive." Jacob's gaze softened, and for a moment the two of them stood together, watching the crops sway in the breeze. It was a quiet moment, one that didn't need words. It wasn't the harvest that mattered most, it was the perseverance, the resilience of the people who had made it through. It was the memory of those who had come before them, the ones who hadn't been able to adapt, and the ones who had the ones like Thomas who had fought for their land, for their families, and for a future that seemed impossible. The years that followed were gentler, the storms less frequent, but the lesson of the Dust Bowl stayed in the hearts of those who had lived through it. It was a reminder that no matter how fierce the storm, no matter how dire the circumstances, survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about adapting. And it was about knowing that the land, though unforgiving at times, could be tamed not by brute force, but by respect and care. By the time Thomas was an old man, the world around him had changed. The Great Depression had long since passed, and the country was rebuilding. But the lessons of the Dust Bowl, the resilience of those who had stayed, remained. The farmers who had once struggled to survive now passed on their knowledge, teaching their children the same lessons they had learned. They shared their stories of how the land had tested them and how they had tested the land in return. Thomas's farm continued to thrive, not just because of his methods, but because he had passed on a legacy of survival, of adaptation. His farm had become a symbol of endurance, a testament to what could be achieved when people came together to fight for what they believed in. As he sat on the porch of his small cabin, looking out over the fields that had once seemed so hostile, Thomas smiled. The storms would always come, but so would the harvest. And for the first time in a long while, Thomas Green felt that the dust had finally settled, not just on the land, but in his heart. The earth had given him everything he had fought for. And in the end, that was all he could ask for.